Okay, welcome to this virtual talk on the ranking of internal and external factors in heritage language change for syntax. Before we go on, just the first disclaimer is that in the meantime, research has evolved and we have concentrated more on internal factors, as you will see. In general, we will talk about heritage languages. Heritage languages are those languages that are spoken by a minority in a place where the majority speaks another language. So they're usually restricted to households. And as such, they are restricted to only some of the uses, of the possible uses. For heritage, the term heritage language is used not only for immigrants, but also for indigenous communities. A heritage language is a language learned at home in a restricted context. So it is not the language that the majority around you speaks. And heritage languages are spoken by bilinguals by definition. Everybody who's a heritage language speaker also speaks the language of the country and the place where they are. And heritage languages are actually ideal for studying the causes of language change. So when you look at language change, in general, you have two main branches of studies. One that concentrates on change, spontaneous, endogenous change. And that's the change that you see happening diachronically, for instance, due to internal factors, but internal in the sense that the language evolves by itself. So, for instance, people start mispronouncing a consonant, speakers start deleting consonants, then there is some sort of reanalysis of the content of the input, and then language changes, but not because of the influence of external languages, other languages. And then there are the change in contact approaches that look at why languages change, what happens to languages when they enter into contact. Within languages, within changing contact studies, there are again those that concentrate on internal factors for language change and external factors. We will, now the definition of internal and external changes depending on the literature you look at. In general, internal factors here overall will be meaning factors that have to do with the grammar and with cognition. So grammar and cognition. Whereas external factors are those factors that have to do with the social use of the language. So the societal input on language change, the desire for speakers to learn the new language or not, the feeling about the language, the use, extended or less extended, the prestige, all these things. These will be the external factors. Internal factors are actually instead here defined as factors that have to do with the grammar itself or with the cognition, so the cognitive abilities of the speaker. We will return to these internal factors shortly. In this talk, we will focus on why structure is in fact very relevant for changing context. So structure, we will try to show that structure is one of the decisive factors for transfer between languages, syntactic transfer. We will also show that macrocontact and microcontact, which are things that I will define in a minute, need to be separate. So macrocontact is hereby defined as contact between languages that are parametrically distant, that, let's say, roughly do not belong to the same family, but also that have a set of macro parameters intended, the Roberts and Ledge way and Baker's way, that is substantially different from that of the contact language. Whereas microcontact is intended to be a contact between languages that belong to the same family, that have the same macro parametric setting, that are really basically identical, except for some features that are linked usually to functional heads or to lexical items. We will show here that macrocontact and microcontact are really substantially different. So they need to be kept separate because languages in microcontact behave really different from languages in macrocontact. We will show that topicality, we will try to propose that topicality is one of the core blocks in languages. All languages somehow assume topicality, and in this sense, macrocontact, the result of macrocontact, the output of macrocontact is sometimes a bit different from everything else. And we will examine three phenomena in particular: null subjects in contact, differential object marking in contact, and deixis and indexicality in contact. Let's go back to internal causes of change in contact. Sometimes what we define as internal causes, internally driven change, resembles a lot of what we see used in diachrony. So when we think of internal causes of change in contact in general, not just for heritage, we are looking at structural causes, so structural similarity. For instance, if you have structures that are substantially the same, transfer is easier. If you have typology, which is the same, typology in the sense of morphological typology, really very simple, without any background thought. So if you basically have an agglutinative language in contact with an isolating language, it is more difficult to transfer, to have morphemic transfer. That's what's been studied a lot in contact studies. They also something that is emerging in the recent literature: cognitive causes. So cognitive causes are the quantity and the quality of the input, processing issues. So something that has to do not so much with grammar, but rather with cognition. Now, typological causes, meant in a different way, which I will define in a minute, and especially cognitive factors, have been the core of heritage studies. Basically, a language 2 acquisition, but in general, contact. If you take the typological literature away, so Eichenwald, Dixon, Heine-Kuteva, all this kind of literature, Haspermat, etc., what we really have the biggest majority of studies on heritage language that have to do with cognition. So we look at what makes it possible for the speaker to acquire one specific structure, one specific construction, the quantity and quality of the input that they received, processing issues. This is easy to process, this is not easy to process. There's really a lot of weight put into that. Whereas structure is lagging a bit behind. It is not infrequent to find people say, okay, we've seen that structural similarity really doesn't play a big role in transfer. There are other factors that play bigger roles. So structure, let's leave it aside. So what you usually see is you concentrate on the cognitive factors that make it possible for transfer between languages to take place. Based on a lot of studies of different sorts, there have been some generalizations that we want to focus on in this talk. And the three generalizations we want to focus on regarding heritage languages are the things that you see here. Avoid indeterminacy. Speakers, L2 speakers, but also heritage speakers, try to avoid indeterminacy in the sense that if you have a polysemous word, if you have a word or a lexical item that has more than one function, you just select one, the prototypical, usually prototypical function, and use it for that, use the word for that function. And also you do not really like words that might mean two things. You really need to be clear about what the function is for every word, especially for prepositions, etc. You see that a lot, but also synonyms, etc. The interface hypothesis is one big generalization that has come up through many studies and from several directions, and it has to do with the fact that if a phenomenon involves an interface or more interfaces, this phenomenon is more prone to change. Now, interfaces here is intended in two different ways. The Fodorian way, which is like the general interface between cognitive systems, and also interface between grammatical modules. So interface between syntax and phonology, interface between syntax and semantics, interface between syntax and pragmatics especially. All these interfaces, this is, I mean, in different papers you find different uses of this interface concept, but basically core syntactic phenomena are usually not so subject to change. You really have change penetrating from these directions involving interfaces with other modules. And then you have avoid silence, which is some sort of an extension of avoid indeterminacy. Heritage speakers do not like ellipsis. They do not like prodrop. They do not like whatever they need to attach reference to, and they need to compute the reference for, and the reference is not so clear. So that's not something that, this is just a general principle that we see over and over again. Now, all these generalizations are based, most of these generalizations are based on acquisition considerations, on performance, and also on typology, which is a different kind of typology, or at least it's a different definition of typology than the one I've just given. In particular, the typological primacy model that Rothman developed needs this to be mentioned because it really captures a lot of generalizations. And it is based on the idea that transfer will take place between languages that are perceived as topologically similar. So if you have, let me give you an example because that's easier to explain. Imagine you are a native speaker of Spanish with second language English, and you're trying to learn Italian. You will transfer a lot of Spanish into your Italian because Spanish and Italian are perceived by the speaker as typologically similar, are overall similar, and this typology, there's a lot of definition behind it, but you imagine first you go to the lexicon. Lexical items are basically identical. Then there's phonology, phonetics, phonology, morphology, etc. The usual scale. But what's important is that the speakers perceive similarities in structure, in lexicon, and then they transfer. Now imagine that you are a native speaker of English with Spanish as your second language, and you're trying to learn Italian. What you will see is transfer from Spanish again. So it doesn't really matter whether you are, whether Spanish is your first or your second language. What matters is that Spanish is typologically similar to Italian and perceived as such by the speaker. So that's what determines transfer. Very importantly, Rothman underlines more and more over and over again that this is a holistic model. So even if you have one specific structure that Spanish and Italian do not share, you will still see transfer from the Spanish overall to Italian, rather than from English to Italian, because overall, holistically, the language is typologically similar, very similar. We need to have this definition for what's going on later, especially to look at things from a microcontact viewpoint. Structural considerations, as I said before, have been largely dismissed because of also this thing of the holistic view on typological similarity. So the average study on heritage language goes as follows. You study a phenomenon in a language, you select some stimuli, you try to test that, you try to understand, to test speakers for acceptability, ask for acceptability judgments on minimal pairs, or you look at the production, you look at the comprehension, and then you say, okay, for instance, the interface hypothesis works, or the interface hypothesis doesn't work, because, and that's the important thing, the why is because of late or early or incomplete or complete or different kind of input. So acquisition, or because the typological profile of one language overrules transfer, overshades transfer, or because the phenomenon is complex in the sense that you have different morphological, typological overlap. So it is complex, or because, especially because the phenomenon involves interface or doesn't involve interface. That's the kind of reasoning. But structure in its own, looking at this structure itself, that's been mainly abandoned. The general assumption is, okay, the choice is macroparametric, a language has a phenomenon X or doesn't have it. That's mostly because the languages that have been studied in heritage languages are languages in the United States. That's where the heritage language tradition started from, obviously, and usually what you see there is, like, you check languages that are really different, like Korean and English, or Chinese, Mandarin Chinese and English, or Spanish and English, or Norwegian and English, with that are, I mean, more or less the same family, but there are a lot of differences. So transfer does not happen if a phenomenon is too difficult, in the sense that it involves too difficult to incorporate. Normally, this we know from traditional contact studies, if you have a gap, if you have something you need, you incorporate, you borrow. And that's very simple to see, very easy to see in the cases of lexical borrowings for interjections, for instance. That's something you borrow immediately because it's easy to incorporate in your language, etc. In heritage language, heritage speakers will tend to lose complexity, in the sense of will try to be as clear as possible, to select one item for one function, basically in this sense. And when there's optionality due to incomplete input or different input or attrition or etc., they will try to make sense somehow, and they will select, at some point they will decide, okay, we express this in this way. They try to resolve optionality. But what if we were actually overlooking structural similarity among phenomena? So really just the tiny details among phenomena. What if the results were different depending on the languages involved, in a non-trivial way? In the sense that if you are talking about the same, basically, macro grammar, and just pass me this term, this is just an operational term to mean, if we are within languages that have the same macroparametric setting, they are really basically the same, and their difference reduced to lexical items or to some functional heads. What if this gave results, contact between these kinds of languages gave results that were totally different? What if microcontact and macrocontact, as I said before, gave systematically different outputs? And the point were not whether the interface hypothesis or the typological primacy model are right or wrong, but at some point that they are gross-grained. So at some point they do not apply anymore, because you are looking at differences that are so microscopic that macrotypology and interfaces no longer apply. What if this was the case? Well, we're trying to show in this talk that it is really the case, so we should really look at this dimension too. Again, macrocontact versus microcontact. Macrocontact is the contact between languages that are typologically different or that belong to different language families. And for the sake of this talk, we will just consider within the same language family. Now, of course, Romance is rather uniform, but we know, Romance scholars know, that there are a lot of differences. They're mainly linked to specific functional heads. So in general, word order is homogeneous, precedence so subject orientation is, we have we have a list of macroparametric typology of Romance, but in Adam Ledgway's books. But more or less, the biggest difference is word order in some between Spanish and Italian in the VP, and also differential object marking is rather fragmented, and especially null subjects. So French is the odd one out when we're talking about null subjects. And Brazilian Portuguese is also in between. But more or less, they are the same macro family. Microcontact is actually instead the contact between languages that are the same language, the same grammar, but for some little difference. So what we went to check, and the project is checking this, is the output of contact then the same? Has this dimension ever been taken seriously? Well, what's the best way to observe language contact? Ideally, you should select, you should go and look at one feature at a time in contact. So you basically look at 2 or 3 or more phenomena, leave the marked aside, there's no time to discuss that. You check these phenomena and what happens to them in diachrony to check whether the diachronic development, let's say endogenous development, not in contact as much as possible, because we know no language is an island, but anyway, if this diachronic development is the same that you observe in contact, you look at these phenomena in contact with similar phenomena or the same phenomenon, which is extremely, like, rather different, exactly identical, but within one little detail, with grammars that are exactly the same, but for this one detail on this phenomenon. And this way you can identify the output of microcontact. In other words, you're going to look, zoom in the feature, zoom in the structure and look at the single feature and possibly also the single lexical item. To do this, this is what we're trying to do. This is the summary of the same. You look at, you have several grammars that are all identical, but for one element X, you check what happens to this element X in contact with grammar B, grammar C, grammar D, and grammar E, all of which have the same element X, which is slightly different and controllable. And ideally, some of these grammars have the same setup for the same parametric value for this feature. So say imagine B and E have the same value. So X in contact with grammar B and grammar E should give the same result if change is due to contact. If change is internally driven, you will not observe any difference. And we will be able to zoom in this specific functional head, so to really observe change at the microscope. The way we decided to do this is through this project. We selected some Italo-Romance varieties. We know that Italo-Romance people, as you can see from the slide, there were several waves of immigration. The one that is of interest to us is the last one after the Second World War, and that's because, mainly because speakers, first generation speakers, are still alive. So we can really check the language they speak with attrition, of course, of disclaimer. I mean, this is a naturalistic observation. We can't do this in a lab. So what we find is we try to find the best. But anyway, first generation speakers are rather old, but they're still alive. Their children and grandchildren are also alive. So you can check in a way through an intergenerational evolution of a phenomenon. We selected languages that have different profiles, and in particular, we selected some phenomena that are different between these languages. So we took 2 languages that for subject lytics behave in a certain way. Then we took upper Southern varieties that are particularly interesting for. So we took 2 representatives of each language for of Italo-Romance. I mean, it's impossible to sample everything. And we tried to look at what happens to some single features in contact with other Romance languages, so French, Spanish, and Portuguese, in particular in the Americas. We also have English. We added English as control, but also we added English because of the fact that the most studies on heritage are done in contact with English, as we said. So we wanted to check whether what we find in the literature is also found for these particular grammars. There have been changes in between. So this was the original plan. In particular, we switched from Canada to Belgium because we wanted to have speakers that left Italy in the 50s or the 60s that didn't go to school or had very low level of education, because everybody who went to school for, let's say, more than the basic cycle is also a bilingual speaker of Italian. That was not the case in the 50s. Not everybody was a bilingual speaker. They were monolingual speaker of these Italo-Romance languages. So we wanted this kind of profile because we wanted to keep the sociolinguistic profile as uniform as possible so that we could factor it out and concentrate on the grammar. Belgium turned out to be a good place for looking for heritage speakers, more than Canada, where we found that most speakers of these varieties are highly educated and all bilingual, at least trilingual in the sense that they also speak English. So we could hear and appreciate a lot of interference with English. So we decided to move to Belgium. But the idea in general was this: we study the same variety in contact with all the Romance languages in the Americas and English, see the direction it takes. We isolate one feature and look at it in microcontact. The socio-historical conditions for this migration were the same, uniform. People left. They were all rather lowly educated, so not very educated. They were monolingual in these varieties. They all wanted to integrate immediately. They had the same attitudes, the same. It is always, this is such a subjective thing that you can never find perfect correspondence, but more or less you can factor out the main sociolinguistic factors that have been reported in the literature. We can still observe optional structures or what's happening in the first generation speakers, although this has proven to be more difficult, even more difficult than we had envisaged. And we can observe internal factors at work by selecting the right features. So what we selected, as I said, was null subjects, differential object marking, deixis, and indexicality. What is reported in the literature? For null subjects in contact, the generalization is rather clear. They tend to disappear. So both L2 learners and heritage speakers tend to use less null subjects than the correspondent monolingual speakers of null subject languages. So this has been reported over and over again for Spanish in contact with English, for many varieties. This has been also interestingly reported for speakers of null subject languages in contact by Sorace and others in 2009. Basically, the tendency is to insert more overt material, more than monolingual speakers would use it, and in pragmatically odd contexts. For differential object marking, the generalization is that it also tends to thin out, to disappear. Differential object marking is usually in Romance marked through the preposition a, which in basically all Romance languages that have DOM except Romanian, that has different prepositions. But importantly, the a is the preposition that is also used for locatives and for datives. So generally what happens is that the speakers select a for datives, and they do not use differential object marking, or if they have to do it, they do it in a different way, or they just lose it. For deixis and indexicality, this is quite interesting because, first of all, there's very little on Romance deixis and demonstrative pronouns, especially in those varieties that have tripartite system. So you have a system that makes reference to the speaker, to the addressee, and not just to the speaker. So there's very little done there. We know in general that indexicalities and whatever is an anchoring to the speech act, etc., tends to stay stable. This has been found and demonstrated shown by Polinsky as really within heritage languages, but by several other scholars of change in contact. Indexicality pronouns, they are really not very affected by change in contact. Now, these generalizations are mostly based on macrocontact, and we wanted to check whether they are really true also in microcontact. Basically, the reasoning is very simple. If the output in microcontact is the same that we see in macrocontact, basically the issue is cognitive. So if a speaker is just unable to handle interfaces. You will see the same in macro or macro contact. If interfaces are involved, they're involved. So the speaker will not be able to process this. The speaker will not like prodrop. In the micro or macro contact, this will be completely irrelevant. If instead you see the difference in macro contact with respect to microcontact, then what you're doing is, then structure is relevant, then features are relevant, then we are overlooking the phenomenon, and the big typological considerations are overshadowing the structural considerations that are, however, playing a role, and we are underestimating them. What we find, of course, is that microcontact is consistently different from macrocontact, and in a non-trivial way. So now is perhaps the good point of pointing out that, of course, we expect, if we want to follow Roberts, who, as we know, is always right, so we want to, at the lexical, so nano and micro level, you expect more random behavior of features, of parameters. So some things go like with the lexicon, one lexical item goes one way, the other one goes the other way, and macro level, one functional head goes one way, the same functional head can go another way. That's what the predictions are. You start establishing things and having things more uniform when you are at the meso and macro level because of clustering, etc. So we didn't find that. We didn't find random. We didn't find behavior that is linked to one functional head only. We found consistently different behavior in microcontact, which is the opposite of what happens in macrocontact, but it is consistent. So it is always in one direction. All languages, all in the same conditions, in different languages, different varieties in macrocontact, they all react the same. So there is something there. We also included creoles just because of some interesting considerations that have been made about them. I mean, while we were reading things, we found over and over again that there's some things that have been observed about creoles that apply exactly the same in microcontact, but not in macrocontact. So macrocontact, contact, what we usually think contact, heritage, like between languages that are different enough, that's the odd one out, in fact. Not microcontact and not creole. That's quite interesting because I think it can tell us something about cognition and grammar and universal grammar in general. So Romance-based creoles are mostly non-prodrop. So for prodrop, we don't have much to say. There have been some cases reported of prodrop, like the example you see in one where you have subject drop. Then read, then seated already just, so imperfective seated already. So you do not have a subject which is expressed overtly. What is interesting about this is that topic continuity has been meant to play a role. So it is topic continuity that triggers prodrop. That's been the observation. And topic continuity is really quite interesting because if you want to know topic continuity, you need to know topic. You need to have to handle topic, and topic is an interface phenomenon. It is the interface phenomenon par excellence. In macrocontact, well, in theory, we would have two possibilities. If you have, say, a prodrop language in contact with a non-prodrop language, in theory, you could insert extra overt material in the prodrop language, or you could see the opposite. You could see that the language which is non-prodrop, the language the language that is non-prodrop at some point starts inserting silent elements. What has been found and consistently reported is that actually option 1 is the one that is most widely attested. So speakers tend to insert overt material in contexts in which monolingual speakers wouldn't. Observe that Montreux also reported cases in which you do have prodrop enhanced in some varieties of English in contact with Spanish. So it is possible to find the other one, but it is rather exceptional. Normally, there is no overuse of prodrop. There is rather overuse or use in wrong wrong, not pragmatically marked or odd contexts of overt material, overt subjects, overt pronouns. Now, since Hook and Müller, but also Platzak, etc., we know that the CP is most vulnerable. So we expect topics to be affected, and that's what happens. But because this is what starts to be attrited. If a phenomenon involves an interface, this phenomenon will be vulnerable to change. So what you do is actually resolve this by inserting overt materials, so you do not have to handle this in interface. You don't have to have a choice between the possible referents. You resolve the ambiguity. In other words, what you do is you delete an interface. You just eliminate the interface with discourse. You eliminate that part of the process for establishing reference. Generalization on our subjects, again, indeterminacy, of course, you don't want it to be indeterminate because you don't really know what this pro is referring to and what it's doing. Interface hypothesis, I've just said, and avoid silence. Obviously, if you have a null element, that's avoid silence. If you look at microcontact now, if you look at Catalan in contact with Spanish, Spanish in contact with Portuguese, and Italian in contact with Portuguese, you see different output for change in contact. This is, there have been several studies, and I'm not going through this, I'm sorry, the references disappeared, but there have been several studies on this. And what we know is that actually there is, prodrop doesn't disappear. No subjects tend to be preserved. What we looked at is actually microcontact, as I told you, between these little elements, these subject clitics, Italo-Romance varieties and Romance varieties in general. And we looked at subject clitics. Now, subject clitics are present in Northern Italian varieties, in particular in Friulian, which is, and Veneto, that are the object, the focus of our study. Observe that these in Friulian are agreement markers. This has been extensively argued for, we know it. But, so Frasson, who is a member of the project, showed that actually subject clitics in Brazil, or in Friulian spoken in Brazil, have a lot of pronominal behavior. They behave like pronouns mainly. So the subject clitics have turned, or are slowly turning, into real, full-fledged pronouns. We looked at speakers of these varieties in Argentina and in Brazil. First generation, we could find very little, but we have an idea. We gave grammaticality judgment tasks and spontaneous production tasks. We listened to really hours and hours of spontaneous conversation. What we found is that heritage speakers are going pro-drop. They tend to omit the subject clitic pronoun in case of topic continuity. Again, topic continuity. So the realization of the subject is determined by interface conditions, not the same that are used by monolingual speakers, new conditions. Topic continuity is only one of the contexts in which you can omit the subject or you can have prodrop. But still, they're creating new conditions, conditions that didn't exist there before because you have subject clitics all over the place. So once these subject clitics become pronouns, they start being dropped. And so if you can look at this graph, you see the first generation use of subject clitics in topic continuity and topic shift. And then you see in contact with Argentina and in contact with, Rio Platense and in contact with Brazilian Portuguese, really topic continuity drops. So you do drops in the sense that you have an enhanced prodrop, which means that prodrop is emerging or it is not disappearing. So in microcontact, heritage speakers are perfectly comfortable with no subjects, given the appropriate discourse condition. Heritage speakers introduce discourse-related constraints on prodrop that are not there before. So microcontact is totally different, is behaving differently with respect to prodrop than macrocontact. If we go to differential object marking, Again, for Creoles, it's not very clear. Some Creoles have been reported to have DOM. It is not very clear that this DOM has been taken up from Portuguese, because Portuguese had a very restricted sort of DOM when it was in contact with the other languages. But in any event, for heritage, this has been very heavily studied. And we've seen that there is omission, basically. Again, the background is that datives and accusatives are perfectly healthy when it comes to DOM. So A marking, DOM disappears. We found exactly the same tendency in heritage Southern Italian in contact with English in New York City. So you have an example in 3. She has seen, to me, that's the form that you use. There is in Cilento. And yesterday I saw my son without DOM. Now, if we look at, again, microcontact, well, historically, Neapolitan was at some point believed to have introduced DOM because of Spanish. This has been proven false. The same for Standard Catalan. It was believed to be to have DOM because of contact with Spanish. It has been proven to be false. It was already there. So there are phenomena of reinforcement. But in fact, you have now some cases are reported of, so Catalan has DOM, but it is restricted to positions in which the subject is not adjacent to the verb, for instance, and pronouns. Benito actually in her thesis reports more and more cases of differentially marked objects that are adjacent to verbs, possibly because of the influence of Spanish. In fact, these are perceived as Hispanicism. What we found is exactly the same. DOM is not only preserved in contact with varieties that do not have it, like French and Portuguese, by these so in contact, when you have Brazilian Portuguese that doesn't have differential object marking and French, you do not see any change. But when you have Spanish, Rio Platense Spanish, for instance, you see that DOM expands, it extends. So we have Argentina, so we checked DOM varieties and non-DOM varieties in contact with Rio Platense, especially, which has very extended DOM, Portuguese and French. We again looked a lot at spontaneous speech and grammaticality judgment tasks. And the result is that in Canada and Brazil, there seemed to be no loss. But what is interesting is that in Argentina, there is a big extension in those languages that have it. And we see emergence of DOM in Friulian and Venetan that do not have it normally for instance, in their Italian counterpart. So you have a lot of DOM is emerging, so it is extended, it is emerging, it is in microcontact. We see that we actually have it. And the interesting part is that the parts in which it is being created, in particular in Friulian and in some cases in Veneto, are in topic contexts. Topic context, sorry, you have it in the previous slide. Okay, I cannot go back to the previous slide. I will not attempt to. Okay, let's in the previous slide you have, if you go back, you see cases of topicalization. In topicalization, you really see consistent DOM. Whereas in heritage Friulian in Buenos Aires, we also even found cases of DOM in situ. For the X's, there's little to say because we didn't find anything different than what was discussed in Macrocontact. We looked at ternary demonstrative systems, like systems that have information for close to the speaker, close to the addressee, or far from both, like you see in Calabrian in 7. You have deictically distinctive forms. We look at a lot of participants, 56 participants. What matters here is that it is very difficult to elicit data for demonstratives. It is really hard. It's speakers have a lot of trouble understanding the tasks. So we tried with picture description with forced stories. This is mine, this is yours, this is his, which one is yours, this or that, etc. Which one, with pens, with objects in the room, all sorts of things. But basically, we didn't find anything. So with speaker and other, so this, that, basically the English way, absolutely no change. When you had the hearer related domain, so this or that close to the speaker, there we see some change happening, 53.6 of target-like responses only, but that's exactly what happens also in diachrony. So for DIXIS, we see that diachrony and changing contact really converge. Now, the usual understanding according to which changing contact and diachrony are the same, so changing contact only accelerates diachronic change. Well, that's not true. That's true only in some cases. In the case of deictics, yes, it is true. So what can we take from this? That's probably that deixis has to do with cognition rather than with structure. So deixis is more cognitive based because you are anchoring to reality. This is not, I'm not the only first person to propose this, but the fact that change is really only constrained by itself and it is not affected by external factors, by contact, etc., tells us that this is really a different thing. It is not UG. It is possibly another module. We have data for Italo-Romance in New York, which show they're rather different, especially complementarizer drop is rather interesting. There's no time for that. I would like to go to conclusions. I've already said microparametric microcontact behaves systematically different from macrocontact. Microcontact is perfectly predictable if we make the right assumption. So it is not random as expected from a model that says that lower levels are more random than the upper levels of the parametric hierarchy. And in general, the further food for thought is that all speakers of at least the languages we identify seem to be able to express topic continuity, and not just express it, but having the need to grammaticalize information about topic continuity. Topic continuity seems to be different from every other discourse-related function. And the fact that change penetrates through the interface shouldn't lead us to believe that topic continuity or topicality is a non-core notion. We usually assume that core notions, core grammar, will not be touched by change. And we say, okay, topics are touched by change. They're the first ones that change, so through which change penetrates, so that's not core. Well, possibly we need to make a distinction between cognitively based grammatical expression and grammatical expressions by themselves, and these topics seem to be, like indexicality, really required by cognitive aims, right, by cognition rather than grammar. But it is one of the core functions, or one of the core notions with which grammar works. So to conclude, microcontact needs to be taken seriously into account because it shows the relevance of the structure. It offers systematically different results than macrocontact, so it is by itself interesting. Null subjects and differential object marking both involving interfaces, and they both contradict the generalizations made on heritage because they're basically they were based on macrocontact, and this is microcontact. And in general, topicality and indexicality behave rather differently than the rest, in the sense that topicality needs to be expressed, indexicality too. Topicality is a place from which change penetrates, indexicality isn't, but they both seem to be core cognitive functions. Thank you very much.